John, can I throw you a curveball and you can take a pass because we didn't warn you this might be a topic. It just popped in my head while we're talking about China and national security and presidential power, which is that from 1789, when George Washington became president, until I believe 1974, 72, 74, presidents had the power to impound money, that only Congress can appropriate funds. The executive can't spend any money that has not been appropriated by Congress. But the president didn't actually have to spend it all, especially on things that he thought were pointless or no longer necessary, et cetera. And just putting this in today's, and so then along comes the Impoundment Control Act of whichever year, 1974. Richard Nixon signed it, but this was Richard Nixon who was weakened by Watergate and who wouldn't have to live with the consequences of it. And ever since then, except for a few years in the late 90s and maybe 2000, we've had budget deficits. As DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, actually just sort of a commission that will, I guess, advise the president and the head of OMB, the Budget Writing Office of Management and Budget. As that comes around, I mean, hopefully you can get Congress to actually make some cuts, but maybe not. And wouldn't it be nice, or maybe it's necessary, for example, for the president to cut some of these legacy defense systems that are enormously expensive and no longer pertinent, especially after the lessons of the Ukraine war, to what a war with China would look like, to preparing for that war, and then hopefully not making it occur. To deter that war, a pet rock of mine is I love aircraft carriers. When I fly into San Diego, I try and sit on the left side of the plane so I can see if any are in port. Love visiting them, love going to the Midway Museum with my kid. But these are $13 billion
targets.
Yeah. Targets. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's before you add the air wing. And, whether it's taken out by 200 drones or one of these new Mach 17 missiles, cruise missiles the Russians have, what if the president, I'm curious about reasserting that, whether it's OMB, just saying, basically, hey, we think that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, that what existed for 200 years before that should exist today. And if we have to go to the court, we will. What do you think just sort of about both the politics and the law?
That's really interesting. I mean, the politics are a winner. The law is harder, but let me start this way. Presidents are allowed to have their own interpretation of the Constitution. They don't have to accept Congress's. And in the area specifically you're talking about, budget and spending, presidents and Congress continuously fought from the founding, as you pointed out, over the power to actually spend the money, right? Jefferson, for example, was appropriated money to build out a navy that was no longer necessary after we had made peace with the French in 1798. I, by the way, think we should never have made peace with the French, but nevertheless, we've made some of these serious diplomatic errors over the years.
Entirely.
Right? So he said, I don't need to spend the money anymore. So I'm just going to let it sit. And nobody thought that was a serious constitutional problem. No one thinks presidents should spend money wastefully. So that went on, as you said, all the way till Nixon. When Nixon became president, he was so weakened by Watergate, he had to accept, in fact, has passed over his veto, the Budget Impoundment and Control Act, which forces the president to spend every dollar, even if it's wasteful, even if remember the bridge to nowhere. Even if Congress says build a useless bridge that actually doesn't connect to anything, the Impoundment Act requires the president to do that. So politically, I think it's a good call for, as I believe he has, the nominee for OMB, Russ Voigt, to say, we're going to try to see whether the Supreme Court still thinks the Impoundment Act is constitutional, whether we reconsider it based on this long history we have had of presidents fighting with Congress and it never being settled. The legal issue is there's a Supreme Court case that clearly upholds the Impoundment Act, also decided very shortly after the law was passed. And Trump is doing this in all these other executive orders too from this week that I don't think people realize what he's doing. He's actually taking positions in other areas that are confrontational to the Supreme Court. They're saying, I'm going to hold a position that's contrary to what the court has said because I want to prompt a new challenge to the Supreme Court and get the court to change its mind. And presidents have always done that and long done it. And that's, I think, what President Trump is doing with the Budget and Impoundment Act. I would say in the end, he has more flexibility, or he should have more flexibility than people think. I don't think the president could, for example, say, I'm not going to spend any money on aircraft carriers, even if you appropriate them. But he could say, I am going to not spend the money wastefully and I'm going to save the money And if we don't need the aircraft, if we don't need 5 aircraft carriers, then I'll build 4. And you can reconsider it and come back to me. I think, there's always been that play in the joints when the spending is wasteful and not in the national interest.
And presumably the area of national security, as with Jefferson sort of today, would be the one where a court would probably be more inclined to give the president power than as opposed to, say, welfare spending.
I mean, the national security is a place where the president's power is at its height. National security and foreign policy and law enforcement. And so, if Congress tried to force the president, these are things we thought about when I was in the government, but suppose the Congress ordered the construction and deployment of inferior weapon systems that were actually more harmful to our soldiers, more vulnerable than the ones we already deploy. I think a president and his commander-in-chief could say, I'm not going to increase the risks to our soldiers and build inferior tanks when we have better ones already available. And you know what? And I don't think the courts would step in. They would let the president and Congress fight that one out. Yeah.
Right.
That's actually a very interesting point when you go back. I think of J.C. Watt and, and the fight that they had over that big cannon. I can't remember the name, but,
the Crusader.
You couldn't name it that today, but Crusader. Yeah.
Crusader. And I remember that. And I still remember when J.C. left. And I still remember, I'm old, the argument that people were having. And, it's the same as the Osprey. How many times did we have the Osprey flying around and keep going and going and going? And, people would talk about that. That's a very interesting argument. That would be interesting to see if Trump would take that. He would make a bold argument. The one thing I will say, I'm not the gentleman I work for now, but I worked for a gentleman in shipping years ago. And the lawyers, the Admiralty lawyers in Hong Kong, I had the biggest Christmas basket of anybody because we were a gift to God to the Admiralty legal profession because Dr. Chin would, very, very active in the courts. And I have always thought that actually is not the worst trait for someone like Trump. I don't mind litigation. I think the fact of the matter is that we have to be in there fighting it out, hunting it out. It is one of the things that kind of amazes me about the D.C. area. And sometimes it's almost they treat every decision as if it's settled law. And, you can go back. They always say the Constitution is living except for what they don't like to be living.